It's hard to think of two generations that had such different experiences than the silent generation, also known as the greatest generation, and their children, the baby boomers. Parent and child, but such vastly different experiences of war and peace, poverty and wealth, unemployment and employment. It bred two very different generations. There really was a generation gap. Let's look at the silent generation first. Born from 1900 to the 1930s, they grew up in a time of great technological change, but for most of them, it was something they saw in the distance. Most people didn't have cars or telephones in the house, or fly in aeroplanes, or even have electricity. As time went on, that changed, but most of this generation grew up without these things that we and our parents take for granted. Most grew up knowing hunger, not starvation, but they didn't always eat 3 meals a day because the money to buy food wasn't always available. They were taught to be patriotic, to be proud of their history, and to be religious. Not all were, of course, but most were taught to be, and most were. They believed in thrift and in good manners. Of course, that didn't mean everyone behaved that way. They served in large numbers in time of war, and as a generation, they saw much of war, and they suffered. They saw much of poverty, even if they were not poor. They saw others who were. But during World War II, people saved money. They had to. The government forced people to buy war bonds. There were war bond drives to encourage people to voluntarily buy even more war bonds. And finally, with so much of industry geared to creating the weapons of war, they were forced to save because there was nothing to buy. Get millions of people to do that, and you have a massive money to invest. That nest egg lasted until the 1960s. When the war ended, the silent generation wanted to get married. They wanted jobs and families. The 1930s had been a time of economic depression. The 1940s, a time of war. Now men and women wanted to be ordinary people. They wanted jobs and houses and spouses and babies. Babies that were known collectively as the baby boomers. The war had meant people moved, new housing was in short supply and new suburbs were built and the infrastructure to support it. Cars became common, credit started to become common. It was a boom time, but it came at a cost. Everything comes at a cost. Nothing is really free. Families became isolated as young families moved away to get housing and better jobs. Mothers were left to look after children without family support, which meant that grandparents couldn't provide support and encouragement. Instead, experts filled the gap. These children had a vastly different experience to their parents. Technology was rapidly changing, but now it was a part of their life. Cars were owned by most families. Telephones became a regular feature in most homes. Flying in an aeroplane wasn't unheard of. Instead, most people came to expect that they would fly, if not today, at some point. Electricity was now common, and with it came television and household appliances. Life for most people was much better. So good, in fact, that many of the baby boomers couldn't understand the life that their parents told them about. It often made parents angry that their children didn't have any real idea of just how good they had it. Some even resented it. What does any of this have to do with nuclear terror and the extinction of man? As it turns out, quite a bit. The silent generation knew war. They had lived through it. They had served and fought and suffered in it. They were both idealistic and practical people. They had ideals and beliefs, but they also understood that the world didn't always pay attention to such things. War was horrible. It had cost them so much. Years away from family at work. It cost money and effort, and it inflicted suffering and death. But the baby boomers heard two very different tales of war. They heard that the war were the best years of their life, about all the good times they had, about the adventures they had been through. But they also heard about the horrors of war, how war wasn't worth it, war should be banned, it was so horrible. This created a schizophrenic attitude in the baby boomers to both their parents and towards war. Because baby boomers had a problem that no other generation had ever been faced with. They were told from a young age that everyone they loved and everything they treasured could be taken away from them in an instant, that atomic bombs were so powerful they could make life on Earth extinct. Those who supported nuclear weapons talked about how powerful were. Those who opposed nuclear weapons talked about how powerful they were, and together they created a sincere belief that the human race would be extinct, and soon. The limitations of nuclear weapons were never discussed by anyone. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan were portrayed as city busters, and subsequent advances in nuclear technology were talked up, but rarely was the fact that Japanese cities of the period were built mainly of wood and paper talked about. Imagine if I told you about an amazing new weapon I'd made that could just destroy buildings made of wood and paper. How impressed would you be? I don't think I've ever seen test footage of a nuclear blast that had a solid brick building. Wooden houses, yes, but not solid structures. Solid structures break up the force of explosions, nuclear or otherwise. Look at the below image of Hiroshima after the atomic blast. What do you notice? That everything that isn't solid has been destroyed, but the solid buildings are still there, seriously damaged, but still there. Nor is radiation talked about properly. Yes, radiation can last for thousands of years, but as a general rule, the shorter the half-life of radiation, the more dangerous it is. A radioactive isotope that has a half-life of 10 seconds will kill you. A radioactive isotope that has a half-life of 10,000 years is basically harmless. Need proof? Hiroshima and Nagasaki are both functioning cities, 1.1 million in Hiroshima and 400 in Nagasaki today. But instead, those who should have given comfort and support gave tales of nightmares. It was widely assumed that this was inevitable. Certainly, that idea that it was only a matter of time until someone made all of mankind extinct gained currency. Live life for today, because there'll be no tomorrow. Eat, drink, do drugs, have sex, spend, spend, spend. Remember, there is no tomorrow. Because tomorrow, or next week, or next year, someone will drop the bomb and mankind will be extinct. Survive? You think you could survive? Haven't you heard that the living will envy the dead? Haven't you been paying attention? There is no way to survive. There is no future. If mankind is to have a future, he must throw off the old thinking that starts wars. Wars can destroy mankind. If man is to survive, he must get rid of courage. Courage encourages fighting. Fighting leads to wars, and wars can destroy mankind. If man is to survive, he must reject the past and find new ways of living. If man is to survive, he must change quickly. So went the thinking. In a way, it's quite logical, but of course, it shows a failing of the silent generation, not the baby boomers. It is the idea that today is important, but the past is not, that history cannot teach us anything because it's old. Only the new can teach us anything. The baby boomers should have been given that comfort, that support. Some were, most were not. The legacy of this period is with us still, and it will be for a long time. It gave a mighty push to nihilistic thinking and made it mainstream. It will be very hard to get rid of it, and we need to do exactly that.